Hello and welcome to part 2 of the history of Hampton Court Palace. If you haven't already, you can go and check out part 1 of this mini-series, which covers Hampton Court in the years 1080 to 1603, plausibly its most famous years with the residency of the Tudor court. Now let's buckle in and talk about what happens next. After Queen Elizabeth I, next to inhabit the palace was James I, or the Sixth, depending on who you ask. This was mainly thanks to the plague raging through the urban cities. His whole court picked up and moved a little further out to the safety of the country. He is said to have loved entertainment and literature, so many a performance was held in the Great Hall over his reign. James also held a religious conference at Hampton Court, leading to the decision to publish his new King James Bible. James did little building on the new structures and improvements, and spent more time focused on maintenance work of the old features of the palace, namely repairing the Great Hall in 1614 and the clock in 1619. His wife Anne died at Hampton Court Palace in 1619, but the court continued to visit annually until his own death in 1625. Next came his son, Charles I, who made some of the most significant updates since Henry VIII's time. He built a new tennis court that has obviously been remodelled since his time, but still continues to be the venue for the British Open Real Tennis Championships. He rearranged some gardens, he made a canal to Longford River that brought water directly to the fountains, and the lead-pipe Tudor drinking water system was updated. Most significantly for historians, he seemed to keep a good maintenance of the contents of the massive palace, an inventory showing he had over 250 tapestries, many dating back centuries. Henry VIII's purple canopy of state was also still in use, as were 4 state beds of his time. Charles got into a tricky position with the Parliament, and in 1648, enemy forces seized Hampton Court. They removed all popish adornments to the chapel and destroyed some of its features. By 1647, Charles himself was captured and was held at Hampton Court, though it wasn't anywhere equivalent to a prison, as he still lived quite lavishly. He was even allowed to host guests. Charles actually managed to escape at one point. He told his guards that he was writing letters in his bedchamber, but after taking an unusually long time, his captors realised he had escaped out to the gardens. Within 2 years, he would be recaptured, but would not be given such freedoms again until his death. Oliver Cromwell spent many of his weekends at Hampton Court, living as lavishly as any king would, though he was, of course, only a Lord Protector. In 1660, Charles II was crowned king, and had frequent visits to the palace, though he made few physical changes. But his reputation of frivolity followed him there. One of his favourite mistresses, Barbara Villiers, lived at Hampton Court with their illegitimate children. He also installed the Windsor Beauties, portraits hung along the communication gallery, painted by Sir Peter Lely from 1662 to 1665, of the most beautiful women in the court of Charles II. Another change to the daily habits of courtiers, to lower the expense of the court, free meals for lower courtiers were abolished. He did update the tennis courts of his father and add a new building for his brother's own apartments. A long water canal was also cut through the park, lined with Dutch limes to welcome the arrival of Catherine of Braganza, Charles's new wife. It wasn't until the 1690s that the palace was extensively rebuilt under the joint reign of William and Mary. Despite complaints they would be too far away to operate business as usual, they decided to permanently relocate court to Hampton Court, as they enjoyed the castle and its gardens more. Sir Christopher Wren was their architect, famous for the St. Paul's Cathedral, Greenwich and many other buildings across London. They were initially planning to demolish most of the Tudor structures and start fresh, which today we are very glad that they did not. Luckily, it proved too expensive and would take too long, and so they had to settle for reusing the old Tudor parts of the palace. These detailed architect drawings also gives us a clear picture of what stood there before the renovation and what was added later. Several versions of plans exist, but many were rejected. The first project was in building a barrack space for the foot and horse guards. Though the palace is famous for its red brick facade, Wren noted that he would have actually preferred stone. However, war with France made that difficult to source. They completely overhauled the east front of the palace. During the work, it was Queen Mary who took charge, whilst William was away campaigning. She spent 6 years overseeing the construction. Sadly, she died of smallpox in 1694, and work on Hampton Court ground to a halt. It was necessary, however, as they had been wildly overspending and owed more than they had to spend. Once the war with France was over, William found the funds to finish up the projects at the palace. He finished the Great Stair, the guard chamber, the communication gallery, and 4 rooms in the king's bedchamber. Rooms around the palace do look sparsely furnished, but this was in tribute to the French styles, making more room for people to stand around and gossip. In fact, they had a lot of inspiration from the French. They also took great care with the garden, designing wide pavilions and mazes like the Palace of Versailles. The last step of the redesign was to assign apartments to the courtiers, and finally the palace was once more flooded with people. Unfortunately, the couple would never get to appreciate their new palace together. In fact, the Queen's apartments were never finished and remained empty for a few more decades, and it was fully completed only shortly before William himself died. With Anne's succession, spending on the palace came to a sudden halt. Maintenance was done when necessary, but no dramatic changes were made under her rule. Especially under William's outstanding debts, many workers went unpaid until she could balance the books. Anne preferred Windsor Castle and Kensington. She mainly used Hampton Court for business and assemblies. In fact, over her first 6 years of rule, Anne had only spent 6 nights at Hampton Court, and it was only in the last 4 years of her life that she ever took any improvement to the palace. A few new art pieces were commissioned glorifying Anne and the naval or military power of Britain. Some alterations to the king's apartments were made, as they were now occupied by the Queen as a female monarch instead. She also remodelled the Chapel Royal with additional panelling, pews, a staircase and an organ. The astronomical clock and Anne Boleyn's gateway were also improved in 1707. She improved the hunting forests, one of her great hobbies, and she maintained the gardens, as they went with a more English garden look than the ornate French styles used previously. When George I took over in 1714, he preferred life at Hampton Court. He built suites of rooms for his son the Prince and his daughter the Princess of Wales, utilising the unfurnished Queen's apartments. Soon, though, the relationship of father and son turned sour, and the Prince left the palace with his family until he would return as king in 1727. George I continued updates, with the tennis court turning into an assembly room and the Great Hall becoming a more permanent theatre. George's reign signalled an ending to the formalities of monarchy, with their courtiers, formal processions from room to room, and their bedchamber etiquette, and the palace became more and more informal as the years continued. When George II made it to the throne, the palace once again became a primary residence. Because of this, the palace was filled up to capacity with the courtiers, the servants, and the royal household. George had refurbished some rooms for his son, the Prince of Wales, and William, the Duke of Cumberland, and redesigned the state apartments and his own private rooms. Under George, the Queen's staircase was also completed, since it was left a blank canvas after Queen Mary II's death around 30 years earlier. Queen Caroline had ordered that the gardens become more naturalistic, allowing the garden beds to be grassed over and topiaries only trimmed. The Queen was to die in 1737, and King George lived another 23 years, but never came back to the palace that they had shared together permanently. It was at this time that the palace was not in royal use, and the building became more and more accessible to the public. At first, some were in the habit of paying the housekeeper for a sneaky look inside. The first guidebook was actually published in 1742 by George Bickham, whose chosen route around the palace is still the one most visitors take today. As George III came to the throne in 1760, Hampton Court formally ceased to be occupied by royals and became a visitor attraction. George bought Buckingham House, as it was known at the time, as his chosen residence, and they preferred to visit Windsor in the summers. A fire broke out in 1770 in some of the outbuildings, and George said that he would not have been sorry if it had all burnt down. It was during this time that Wolsey's 5-storey Great Gatehouse on the west was reduced to 2 stories due to its unstable condition. The gardens were no longer trimmed, and many noted that they started to look unkempt and wild. The gardener Lancelot Brown also planted the Great Vine in 1768, which is still a big attraction today. However, despite the King and Queen's absence, the palace was still home to many. In the 1740s, a poorer group of courtiers were given residence there in the summer months. This spiralled into what is known as residence by grace and favour. Beginning in 1767, the palace became divided into various apartments for those needy, often lower courtiers who had fallen on hard times. It became a more organised practice in 1773, as official documentation was kept as to who was granted apartments and the contract for this. There were 50 or so of these apartments, each with anywhere from a few small rooms to 12 or 16 rooms in total. By 1770, these apartments were all occupied, and a waiting list had started to form. By the 1840s, these apartments were almost solely for widows of war. A parliamentary review recorded 60 to 70 households residing in the palace, which in turn meant about 150 to 200 servants. William IV had dubbed it the Quality Poorhouse. But despite everyone being a grace and favour resident, there were still apparently huge quarrels over status and rank within the palace. It seemed like a very hostile residence. It could be seen as grandeur to live in a palace full of servants. However, if you look a little deeper, things were not all as they appear. Remember, it had been over 100 years since George II had lived in this palace, and modern amenities were nowhere to be found. There was lack of toilets, sanitary sewage systems, kitchens were on the other side of the palace, and there was no electricity or heating. It took a very long time, but slowly these apartments were outfitted with more modern standards. Some distant royals still maintained some residence, like William IV's illegitimate children. The Grand Duchess Zina Alexandrovna, sister to the assassinated Tsar Nicholas II, Lady Baden-Powell, head of the Girl Guides and widower to the founder of the Boy Scouts. Her apartment spanned 16 rooms, including north of the Great Hall and parts of the Great Kitchen. One fireplace she had converted to a bathroom. In the 1880s, Princess Frederica, a descendant of George I, made some of the last building additions to the palace in her apartments. In 1838, Queen Victoria opened up Hampton Court to the public. Up until then, it had only been the wealthy bribing the housekeepers to be allowed to enter, but now everyone could enjoy the grounds and a tour of the palace. The grace and favour residents weren't all too keen with this new rush of public attention. Visitors changed the dynamic of the palace, as they wanted to see the glorious romantic Tudor palace. Unfortunately, this wasn't just a Tudor palace anymore, as centuries of history had been layered on top of it. Discovering and recovering the design styles underneath the history of the palace was a job of many architects and designers. James Wyatt was one of these people in 1840 to 1846. He aimed to let the history shine through and restore the early centuries of the building. Pulling back most of the lost elements of the Tudor palace, the Great Hall as his centrepiece. However, the Tudor essence may have been embellished and glorified a little, adding heraldic badges of Henry's wives, which would never have been there all at once. He repainted the chapel ceiling, which Queen Anne had painted white, and he restored it to King Henry's blue with gold stars. Outside, the Georgian sash windows were replaced with Tudor-style casements. Chimneys were restored to more odd shapes that were probably never there, but were based on designs found at other Tudor houses. John Lascelles also worked on the restoration at the end of the 19th century. He again gave more priority to a Tudor appearance, repairing Anne Boleyn's gateway and the Tudor clock. 10 million visitors came to the palace by 1881. More and more facilities had to be built to appease them. Toilets, cafes, small shops, restaurants, and 9 hotels. They soon discovered that significant wear and tear on the palace had to be maintained. Never had more than 10 million courtiers walked down these corridors before. Much of this involved significant reflooring with more durable materials. Protective grills were also installed around pieces of furniture as security became a concern. In 1882, a fire broke out in the apartment above the Queen's Gallery. In the case of fire, the rebuild was always done to preserve Tudor styles. 4 years later, another fire destroying 75 rooms in the north front. 40 new rooms were built specifically for grace and favour residents, rather than have them occupy the older areas of the site. After World War I, the gardens had been neglected, and there were attempts to restore the gardens to their earlier form of glory. The 20th century brought with it more of an emphasis on correct ways of presenting and preserving the history of the palace. There was a representation attempt in the 1930s to display the rooms as they may have been, rather than a collection of old furniture, making the displays a bit more historically accurate to certain time periods. Restoration had been all about uncovering what was once there, or may or should have been there, and instead preserving what was there and conserving it at all. The roof of the Great Hall was found to be decaying, as was the chapel, and work began immediately to rectify this. New structural supports now bear the weight. Ernest Law planned and implemented many of these new focuses and displays, supervising what he could. Law uncovered the moat and bridge at the entrance to the palace at the Great Gatehouse, filled in during William and Mary's reign to make a circular turning way for grander carriages. Most of the original gate had survived, and they used what they could and resurfaced the entranceway. Parks around the palace were used for growing crops in both world wars. The palace was targeted with bombing raids, mostly unsuccessful, with some incendiary bombs hitting the East Front on September 26 of 1940, but they were quickly extinguished and there was little damage. The practice of granting grace and favour residency in the palace ended in 1969. Only 2 palace residents remain, and staff still live in the palace. You can find traces of this past around the palace, from door numbers to nameplates. Hampton Court would no longer be considered a living palace, and its governance and maintenance were transferred from the royal family to the Directorate of Ancient Monuments and Historic Buildings. £2 million would be spent from 1974 to 1980, improving the palace and its facilities. More rigorous conservation efforts, repairs to be made from handmade and traditional methods, rolling efforts to replace old or rotting Tudor bricks. Lady Baden-Powell finally gave up her apartments in 1976, and finally the Great Kitchen could be restored to its present and previous state. In March of 1986, another fire occurred on the south front. It began in the apartment of Lady Gale. Much of the roof, around 60 metres, collapsed, crashing into the King's State apartments. The palace at the time had its only fire brigade, who swung into action. They were able to remove most valuable art and decor pieces. In fact, the fire only consumed 1 table and 1 painting. They were able to record the damage and repair what they could, but they had to wait 3 years for it to dry out the burned sections of timber. The gardens were brought back to immaculate detail to reveal William III's Baroque-inspired gardens. They became a focus on the spaces themselves, how they were presented and contextualised for the public. In 1989, the palace and other unoccupied royal palaces became united under Historic Royal Palaces Agency. It employed costumed guides to bring the palace to life once more, offering programming and guided tours ever since. The early 1990s were dominated by restoration. The King's apartments, the Tudor kitchens, the Cumberland Suite, the Privy Garden, and the Queen's private apartments. Official reopening was July of 1992. And that brings an end to this video on the history of Hampton Court Palace, as we catch up to present day. However, its story certainly doesn't end here, as I'm sure the palace has a much longer future ahead of it. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of this lengthy mini-series, as I just couldn't bear to cut out too much. But I would really recommend reading up on further anything that you found interesting. For example, I had no idea that the palace used to have apartments, and that's definitely something I will be on the lookout for when I go and visit. Please let me know if you have had the pleasure of visiting this historic palace, or like me, is it still waiting to be ticked off the bucket list? Thank you for joining me, and goodbye for now.